if in the mission to try and get a cheap buck, we're hovering towards a massive disaster. Now, there's a staggering new number that I read today regarding immigration. The number of net arrivals to Australia, which means the people leaving versus the people arriving, was 454,000 people in the full year to March. Now, just to clarify, we're not talking about tourists or people that might come for a few weeks and check out the Opera House and the Great Barrier Reef. We're talking about people moving to Australia to live. And the net total was 454,000 in the year to March. That's a record. And here's the reality. Migrants don't want to live in the bush. Sydney and Melbourne shoulder the biggest load. According to the Daily Mail, Sydney's inner southwest, covering Bankstown and Lakemba, took in the most migrants from 2016 to 2021, along with Parramatta, while the Blacktown population grew by 8.6% in 5 years. Our population is booming, and the largest part of that is migration. And with a housing crisis, issues with rent, and all the other issues you hear on a daily basis, is this policy really in the best interest of Australia? Frank Carbone is the Mayor of Fairfield. He's on the line for us this afternoon. Frank, many thanks for your time.
No problem. Good afternoon, James.
How concerned are you by what you're seeing here in terms of migration numbers?
Well, first of all, just for people to understand, I mean, we always welcome migrants. Western Sydney's always welcomed migrants, especially a place like Fairfield. But I think it's about working out what is the right amount. How many people can come into the country and into Western Sydney in a sustainable rate. And, I mean, you don't need to be an economics expert or a housing expert to see that when we go to the grocery store, we're paying more. To pay the rent, when we're going to pay rent, we pay more. When we're looking to buy a house for our kids to help them out, we're paying more, and it's unaffordable. And simply that's because of a result that migration has actually increased threefold over the last 2 years. So Australia used to take in roughly between 160 to 210,000 per year prior to COVID. That has dramatically jumped, and the federal government's bringing in about 1.4 million over the next few years. And that's going to have an impact. We're all going to suffer through quality of life when it comes to being able to afford to buy a house, to be able to get better jobs. I mean, we're for migration, but it needs to be sustainable and it should not impact our quality of life. And we're seeing that out here. We're seeing a lot of people living in illegal buildings. In Western Sydney, especially a place like Fairfield, we actually have the highest amount of occupancy per household, which is 3.2. The state average is 2.5. And only today, I became aware of a place where even landlords are taking advantage, and they're trying to put 6, 7, 8 people into a house where it's just not sustainable. There's not enough parking. There's not enough infrastructure there. They're doing these things illegally, and this is really hurting councils. And this all comes from the federal government's policy, which is the migration policy. You cut the migration policy, you'll be cutting interest rates, inflation, and housing will be more sustainable. And I think the federal government and the state government needs to look at it. They haven't done that. I mean, we have out here in Bonnyrigg, we have the old social housing area of Bonnyrigg, which is now the New Leaf. The state government's selling it off to private people, and they're selling off blocks of land, of social housing land, for $1 million a block. How can that be right? How can the government, at a time where people cannot put cannot get a roof over their heads, is selling off taxpayer land for $1 million through private organisations, James? It's just not right.
Yeah, and at the same time, and you flagged this when I heard you on Ben Fordham's show a few weeks ago, that they're talking about the fact that we're a mile behind on our housing build targets, and they've just made it harder for people to build a house by adding a levy or a tax or an infrastructure contribution on the new strata apartments and homes. Per home, it's between $10,000 and $12,000.
So the government has all its policies wrong. They're bringing in too many people at a time when we've got too much high interest rates, where people are struggling, where we've got high inflation. It's time to take the foot off the pedal a little bit. So what does the state government do? At a time that when they face the cameras, they say to people, we want to help people get into a house. But what they actually do is they go and put a 12,000. Every new home in Sydney, in New South Wales, will be hit with a $12,000 new levy. It's a tax, let's be honest, it's a tax. Why are you taxing something if you want to help people? You give first home buyers $7,000 with one hand and you take $12,000 through the back door with the other hand. It's just ridiculous. This does not encourage, this is not good policy. Now they're talking about bringing in portable homes. This is not good policy. We need to maintain a reasonable standard of life, of quality of life in Sydney that we expect. And it's Western Sydney that's taken all the brunt. The population's increasing and the government is causing a divided city. They are dividing our city, our suburbs and our people through different classes because people are settling out in Western Sydney because, quite simply, the house prices are cheaper. It's not cheap anymore, but that's the problem, and that's why we've got higher levels of unemployment in Western Sydney. The government doesn't talk about that. We've got unemployment that's 3 times the national average. We just need some common sense to the debate. We're not against migration. Migration is really important to us, but it needs to be sustainable. But at the moment, it doesn't matter if it's state or federal, their policies are wrong. They talk about this housing building fund, which they talk about it being $10 billion. The truth of the matter is they're only going to be spending $500 million a year. That's not even 1,000 homes. This state alone needs 150,000 homes per year to keep up. That's not going to happen by the state government also selling off social housing for $1 million.
Okay, but what role do local councils play in us being behind on our targets? And you hear from every builder, and the time it takes to get a DA approved is just ridiculous. In the old days, you could basically get it on the same day. Now we're talking months and months and months for a very basic approval.
So this is all the red tape. The federal government's putting in the basics requirements, which is going to increase housing by another $20,000. Ultimately, the state government determines the guidelines and how councils assess it. Now, I'm very lucky that Fairfield's actually the fastest. We've got 50-day turnaround in Sydney. But the point is, we've got 30,000 homes approved, but we don't build homes. It's up to the developer to build homes. It's up to people to buy it. But James, tell me, who can afford to buy a home right now? You're paying 6-7% on interest rates. You're paying $1 million for a block of land. You just simply can't afford it. It's not councils that build homes. We're approving homes. We have 30,000 rezoned, all ready to go. But it's up to the developers, and the developers can't make money because simply there are too many taxes, state and federal government taxes, and the prices are so high that people can't afford to buy them. So it's not just about providing a home, it's about making it affordable, James. And the state government, I see, is now looking to put portable buildings. Well, I'm sorry, that's not the quality of life that we want in our country.
No.
We don't need to dump portable buildings in everyone's backyard. That's not the solution. That's just a Band-Aid solution. What we need is good policy, take the taxes off, make housing more affordable, and slow the migration down so we can start building more housing. And as we build more housing, and I'm talking about quality housing, then you can slowly increase the migration. Because don't forget, it's not the councils. Everyone talks about the councils, but the government has tripled the intake of migration in 2 years.
Absolutely.
So
I've got to go.
How would you expect to increase it? Yeah.
Frank, I really appreciate your time. Well said.
No problem. Have a good night.
Frank Carbone, the Fairfield Mayor, joining us on the line. He talks a lot of common sense, that bloke. Do you agree with him? Give me a call, 131873. The budget papers today say net overseas migration in New South Wales will contribute almost 500,000 people to the state's total expected population growth. And overall economic activity would be weaker without this rapid rise, so they're in there for the cheap buck. But the papers also acknowledge the post-pandemic return of migration has left the state's housing supply struggling to catch up to demand. Of course it is. And if you have this crisis already where not everyone wants an affordable home, it's great to build them, and sure, but people just want to get into the market or find a place to rent. And if we're already at crisis point, what does 500,000 people arriving in New South Wales over the next 3 or 4 years do to that crisis which is already bursting at the seams? 131873 is our open line number. 454,000 people arriving in the last 12 years. Now, look, Frank made the point off the top, and it's very, very sensible. This isn't about an attack on migrants. Australia's got a very proud history of migration. It's raw numbers. And it's not just the homes, it's the roads, it's the hospitals, it's the schools. So I agree with what Judith Sloan's had to say today, which is in the Australian newspaper, unless the government is prepared to bite the bullet and reduce the number of migrants entering the country as well as insist that temporary migrants leave, there will be an ongoing crisis. Spot on the money. What say you? 131873. We'll take a break. Back very soon.